Hey guys, happy 2023. Welcome to Can't Make This Up, a history podcast where I sit down with historians and authors and just chat about their latest work in history. My name's Kevin, I'm your host. It's the new year. Hope it's off to a great start for you. It's January, it's a little cold out. It's been pretty mild lately, but there is some snow on the way. And so it's kind of an appropriate time to talk about today's topic, and that is Arctic exploration. My guest today is Buddy Levy. He is a historian. He's written a little bit on adventurers and explorers, and he's joined me to talk about his most recent book, Empire of Ice and Stone, the disastrous and heroic voyage of the Karluk. Really interesting conversation today. We're going to be talking about the Arctic in the polar regions up north, what a strange and a very dangerous place that is. We talk a little bit about the desire to go and explore that part of the world, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And then we talk a little bit about the people who call that part of the world home, the Inuit. So really fascinating discussion today, and hopefully you guys will enjoy it. If you are brand new to the podcast, welcome. I've got a lot of content. If you look back through the archives on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening, a lot of stuff to listen to. And if you find that you Can't Make This Up, please feel free to subscribe to it, and leave a review. My goal for this year is I want to try to get 10 written reviews on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. So if you guys could make that happen, if you guys could give a rating or review, that would be wonderful. All right, without further ado, here's my guest, Buddy Levy.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools, and stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
Buddy Levy, welcome to Can't Make This Up.
Hey, Kevin, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you. You are our first guest of 2023.
Oh, I'm honored.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and your background. It seems like you are a historian of adventure and exploration.
Yeah, well, I guess I would call myself an accidental historian. I ended up, I have a couple of degrees in English literature and creative writing. And I have been a professor of writing for a number of decades. But back in the 2000s, the late 90s and the early 2000s, I stumbled into this adventure racing world, which was actually being televised by the impresario Mark Burnett, who created Survivor and The Apprentice and a number of other shows. But at the time, he had created this show called the Eco Challenge, and I got involved in traveling around the world. It was a very fortunate gig that I was writing about these people who were traveling around the world to all these far-flung locales and doing week to 3 week long multi-sport endurance competitions through mountains and deserts. And I traveled everywhere from Morocco to Greenland to Borneo. And
that's a pretty good deal.
Yeah, it was a great gig. And it ended up by accident, as it turned out, I heard that this blind adventurer named Eric Weinmayer was going to be competing in this event in Greenland in 2003. And I was at the tail end of writing about this sport, and I decided to go there and follow him and got embedded with him and his team. And I followed him around through the mountains and fjords of Greenland. And it was just remarkable. And I actually ended up meeting this Norwegian woman who handed me a book called the first crossing of Greenland by Fridtjof Nansen, a famous Norwegian explorer. And that was back in 2003. And that sort of propelled me to begin paying more attention to Arctic exploration and expeditions. And I have to add that I had my father was a Nordic ski racer back in the 50s, and he competed in the Winter Olympics. And so I grew up in a ski town. So I was in Idaho. I grew up in Sun Valley, Idaho. And so from a pretty early age, I was taken out into super cold places and cold weather. And I really was intrigued and enamored with the explorers who could do this for weeks and weeks and months and even years on end. So that's kind of the thumbnail sketch of how I landed on Arctic history, even though I have written about a whole bunch of other kinds of historical expeditions.
All right, so the Arctic is kind of its own little subgenre within history, and it's really fascinating. And so for starters, I guess, can you explain to listeners what the Arctic is like, and why is it so dangerous to attempt to explore?
Wow, that's such a great question. I think what's interesting is that it isn't that long ago, not much more than 100 years, where we still, humans still hadn't even been to the North Pole. So there was always a lot of mystery and question about what was up there. And for centuries, explorers from Scandinavia and from Europe and from England had been trying to sort of crack the code on the Arctic and figure out what lay beyond the Arctic Circle. And there was even a great deal of mystery and we'll call it confusion, since no one had been there, about what was up at the North Pole, and to the extent that people actually believed up and through the late 1880s that there was a ring of ice encircling the North Pole, and if you could crack through this ring of ice, it was a tropical paradise up there. It's kind of remarkable now that we have, global satellite images and images from the space station. But I think one thing that people don't realize is how there's this idea that the Arctic is kind of this flat, sheen, glazed surface of ice, kind of like a rink, and that moving along it isn't necessarily that difficult. And the reality is that it's a polar ice is this moving, almost living thing, and you've got giant, sometimes plates of ice that are maybe 15 to 30 miles in length and width, and they're moving along on wind and current and being carried on this, along the currents, and they're bashing into one another, and they're creating these ruptures and fissures, and it's a really dangerous place, but it has kind of what I would call a terrible beauty, a terrifying beauty, in that if you're on it, it looks incredibly beautiful. There are formations that are like dinosaurs, and there are like gargoyles, and the wind shears it, and it turns it this tourmaline blue and emerald green. But at the same time, it's moving and opening, and and you can be just engulfed in it, and giant ships can be crushed by it. And if you're on foot or skis or being pulled in sleds by dogs, you can be just engulfed by these leads or fissures. And so it's a remarkable, vast place that we're still to this day learning a great deal about.
Well, and even the sun is weird up there. The day and night become bizarre.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I was so struck by when I started writing about these explorations is, because of the latitude and longitude, the sun, they have this what's come to be called by explorers the long night. And so once the sun typically, in late fall, descends below the horizon. Depending on where you are, how far north you are, it won't return again, sometimes for as long as 4 months. So if you can imagine the sun going down, and then the next time it reaches the horizon and rises again is 4 months later. So you have explorers generally on ships, but going out onto the ice when it's safe enough to do so. And often, they know when the sun is going to go down, and when it does, then say at the winter solstice, or earlier than that, when it finally goes down, they're going to be in a kind of state of perpetual twilight for months, and that contributed to a lot of malaise and depression and anxiety, that we know about now, but they were just learning about. They didn't have really the language to describe it. But certainly, you hear about things like cabin fever, and when you've got a bunch of men on a ship, and it's dark and you're moving around through lantern light, it can be really eerie.
Yeah, that's terrifying in and of itself. All right.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, the book that we're going to talk about today, your latest book, is Empire of Ice and Stone: The Disastrous and Heroic Voyage of the Karluk. So can you tell us what prompted the Karluk expedition in 1913?
Sure. So there was this Arctic explorer and scientist named Vilhjalmur Stefansson, who had just returned from living above the Arctic Circle for 4 years, and he was really an interesting character. He's very complex, and as you'll see in the book, I spend a great deal of time talking about his character and personality, because he's really an interesting person. And very ambitious. So he organized the first Canadian Arctic expedition in 1913, and it was pretty grand in its initial plans. There were 4 ships and 24 scientists who were going to go up and study the people above Alaska and Canada in the Arctic, and also search for new lands. There'd been some speculation that there was a landmass that had not been discovered yet. So he gets all these scientists and ships together, and they convene in Nome, and then they make their way up to Point Barrow above in northern Alaska. And the plan is to take these ships and head east to this place called Herschel Island, and they're going to meet there with all the ships, rendezvous, and then get all the scientists and all the gear on the right ships, and then dispatch in these 2 separate parties, the northern and the southern party. Well, and I have to say that Stefansson had the good sense to bring along with him this famous captain named Robert Bartlett, who had been with Robert Peary on a number of Peary's North Pole expeditions, and Bartlett himself had been to within 150 miles of the North Pole, so he was very experienced in ice travel. And the problem was that when in August of 1913, as they're rounding Point Barrow and heading off to meet and rendezvous at Herschel Island, things just deteriorate from the beginning, in part because of poor planning on Stefansson's part, and then also the vicissitudes of weather. So there's this massive August storm, what we would consider a winter blizzard, here in the lower 48, but it's happening in August, and the ships are blown off course. They're separated, and they never even make the rendezvous point at Herschel Island. And by this point, the wrong scientists are on the wrong ships, and the only good news was that Stefansson himself was on this Karluk, which was the flagship of the expedition, and Bartlett is the captain of that ship, hired by Stefansson. And so they're together for a while, but it's one of those weird stories in which really quickly, like within weeks of setting off, things begin to deteriorate, and it becomes less about discovery and science and more about survival quite early on.
Hey gang, I wanted to take a little break from our conversation today to tell you about the new partner of the podcast, Libro.fm. If you're like me and you have a long commute, or if you spend a lot of time with your AirPods in and you're listening to something, you might enjoy audiobooks, just like I do. Well, Libro.fm is an audiobook subscription service in which you can get a credit for a new audiobook every month, but also you can purchase additional audiobooks at a pretty decent discount. And the kicker for Libro.fm relative to other audiobook services is that a portion of every sale goes to support an independent bookseller of your choice. So it's a great way that you can listen to audiobooks while also supporting independent bookshops. So if you'd like to check out Libro.fm, there is a link for it down in the description of this episode in your podcast app. And if you want to join up with that link, you can get an additional audiobook credit in your first month. So check out Libro.fm. Now back to our conversation. A theme throughout your book that comes out pretty quickly is the different personalities between Bartlett and Stefansson. Can you tell us a little bit about who these two figures are and how they're kind of completely different people?
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because you have it's a tale of two leaders, really. Empire of Ice and Stone is really a story of two men and their different leadership styles. And it kind of surfaces over time, So what you have is Stefansson is a really brilliant he's an amazing person. He grew up in he's an Icelandic American, but he grew up in North Dakota and then went off to college and finished his degree in Iowa. Then he went to Harvard, and he's a visionary. He's very ambitious, and he's really good. I have to say, he was really good at living in small teams on the ice with Inuit technique and having Inuit guides. But his attempt at this major expedition with multiple steamships was a bit outside of his organizational abilities, right? And he was really known for being persuasive. Stefansson was really persuasive. He was able to garner hundreds of thousands of dollars and the backing of the Canadian government to take on this project. His counterpart, Robert Bartlett, grew up in Newfoundland, and he was came from a family of really, really well-known Atlantic mariners and ice captains and seafarers. And so he had spent most of his entire life on a ship at sea, and with periodic sort of popping in back home in Brigus, Newfoundland, to basically repack for the next trip. But Bartlett is much more of I would call him, a team-based player, where Stefansson was a little bit in it for himself. Stefansson had sold all sorts of media and publishing rights to his expedition, and was planning to come back and go on lecture tours and write books and write hundreds of articles. Whereas Bartlett, viewed himself as a ship's captain. Bartlett happened also to be what Robert Peary, the famed polar explorer, called the world's greatest living ice navigator. So you have these two really different personalities, and those personalities surface when things get difficult.
So what are some of those difficulties? You mentioned that very early on, things start to go awry. What are some of the issues that the expedition was facing?
Right. So when within a few weeks after departing, and they're heading toward Herschel Island, toward the east in the Beaufort Sea, the Karluk becomes encased in ice. Like I said, these massive floes, they're called floes, are drifting around in the ocean. And the captain of the captain of the ship, Bartlett, is looking for open leads, or they're almost like rivers of water between ice chunks. So the way to do it is to try to navigate and wend your way through these leads. Well, the storm is so strong that the ship gets encased in ice and what is called in the day beset. So it isn't able to go anywhere. It's like frozen in. And then the ship begins to drift, encased in about 1.5 miles square of ice. So it is no longer navigating on its own, but the ship and this big block of ice are floating along at the whim of the current and the wind. And the prevailing wind in that area is toward the northwest this time of year. So
they're not starting to floating, but they're getting blown off course.
Yeah, they're just being they're drifting, and the wind and the current is pushing them away from the Alaskan coast. And so Stefansson realizes where they are. They're still at a certain point within maybe 10 or 20 miles from the Alaskan coast. And a couple of major things occur that change the outcome of the entire story and the lives of many of the people on the ship, which is that in mid-September of 1913, Stefansson decides that he's going to take a few of the scientists, and he had also, I should mention that Stefansson had hired on in Point Barrow a number of Inuit hunters, dog sled drivers, and a family of Inuit people who were hired. The husband was hired to hunt, and the wife to sew Arctic clothing. And then they brought along 2 young children, 2 girls. One was 11 and one was 3. And they're just, they came along and they were going to help. But so Stefansson makes this fateful decision to leave the ship with a few of the scientists, 2 of the best hunters, and 12 of the best dogs, and to strike for land across the frozen polar sea. And
he just takes off.
He just takes off, and he says to Bartlett that he's going to be now he's the expedition leader, so he can kind of do what he wants. But I have to say that Bartlett was not pleased about this, and he thought it was a bad idea. Not only because it was a major storm was happening and the ice was dangerous, but because the expedition leader is in effect abandoning his ship. But he said he would be back within 10 days to 2 weeks. Unfortunately, Stefansson's gone for only 2 days when a massive storm, like a major blizzard, hits. Stefansson himself and these 2 scientists or 3 scientists that are with him and the 2 hunters are stranded on this little island off the north coast of Alaska. And the Karluk is now blown and is moving between 30 and 60 miles a day out into the middle of the Arctic Ocean. And so you've got this amazing separation that is just, when the fog lifts, Stefansson's stranded on this little island and his ship is nowhere to be seen.
And so then I'm assuming it's left to Bartlett to figure out how to get the crew to survive.
Right. So what's really fun about this story, I should say fun. It wouldn't have been as much fun to have been there. But what's really intriguing about the story is that, and because I have the beauty of the hindsight of history and documentation, is that so I move back and forth between what Stefansson's doing and then more to the point what Bartlett and the members of the Karluk are doing, because there's a half dozen scientists still on the Karluk. There's a number of crew members, the Inuit family, and 30 sled dogs. And so I move back and forth between the Karluk and its perils, which are significant, and they're about to become more significant. And then Stefansson and what he does or doesn't do once he actually manages to make it to land, and then the decisions that he makes. But from the point where they become separated, the story and the reader spends much more time on the Karluk and with the members, because their journey and ordeal is really just beginning.
And so you mentioned they have these crew members, or maybe rather passengers, these indigenous people from the Arctic. What were the views of the leaders and the crew regarding the Inuit?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, Bartlett himself had been in Greenland for years, with Perry, and he had worked closely with Greenlandic native peoples, and really, I mean, they taught him a great deal about how to survive in the Arctic. The scientists who were on the Karluk were quite interested in fact, they tried to learn. They spent, they were drifting in the Karluk for many months, and so there was time to attempt to have classes aboard the ship and learn the language, so that they could communicate better when they were going to need to, if they ended up being stranded on the ice. And then, but there was a little bit of, the crew members themselves were not educated people. They were just, sort of shipsmen who they were a little bit, I mean, there was a great deal of racism at the time. So the crew members were kind of like, first of all, why are we bringing this family along? And then, they were a little, because they had to make room for them. But I have to say that they changed their tune quite quickly when they realized that they wouldn't survive without them, because the wife and mother of the children, Auntie, her name is Karluk, but she goes by Auntie. They nickname her Auntie. She is an expert master seamstress and knows how to make pants and parkas and boots and mittens out of reindeer hide and polar bear skin. And, without her, they would have probably all frozen to death. Her husband, Karluk, is masterful at hunting, at running dogs, at building igloos, at navigating through the ice, at knowing when you shouldn't be on the ice. And I mean, without them, I make the case that everyone would have died. And so Stefansson did have the good sense to hire this family. It's one of the smartest things that he did. And Bartlett, there's another hunter named Karluk who Bartlett becomes very close with, and he's only 19 years old, an amazing guy, and they are really, really a big part of the story.
I find that part fascinating. It's almost as if these people live here and they know how to do it.
Well, yeah, they did. Yeah. They lived near Point Barrow. They had spent a great deal of time on the ice, and they understood, first of all, how to procure game. Out there we're talking mainly seal and walrus. On shore there would have been caribou, but when the Karluk drifts out into the middle of the Arctic between Alaska and Russia, they understand how to get seals, right? And they're very patient and excellent hunters. So we learn a lot about the techniques that they use to procure seals, and it's really amazing. So once they're drifting, then it's a question of how long is this ship going to drift? Where is it going to end up? And when will it be crushed? Those are sort of the questions that are in everybody's mind as they're floating along through the polar darkness.
All right, well, buddy, this has been an interesting conversation and a look at a really fascinating adventure story. Perfect for January. And there's certainly more to learn here. If people wanted to pick up a copy of your book, where can they go, and where can they go to learn more about you?
Sure. You can learn more about me at buddylevy.com. And also my books are available at all indie bookstores, wherever books are sold. And of course, online at some of those outlets. that are well known.
All right, Buddy Levy, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate it. And it's true, you can't make this up.
Hey guys, well, thank you for hanging out with me for another episode of Can't Make This Up. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Buddy and learning a little bit about the history of exploring the Arctic. Hopefully, if you ever find yourself stranded up by the North Pole, your ship captain won't abandon you on the ship. If you want to read a little bit more about the Empire of Ice and Stone, and there's a lot more detail to go into in the book, there is a link for it down in the description of this episode in your podcast app. That takes you over to a website called indiebound.org, and that will put you in touch with your local bookseller in your area. Pretty cool website. And then if you want to listen to the book in audio, there is a link for it down in the description as well. All right, well, the new year is off to a great start, and looking ahead, I have some exciting things to do with the podcast. Dean Job, who's I think has the record for most appearances on the podcast, he'll be joining us yet again to talk about some of his research up in Canada, and we'll be doing a little bit of true crime after that. So some exciting things just around the corner. Until next time, thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll see you then.